Hi, welcome back to CBSE Board Economics. I'm Saddam Hussain. Today we'll be discussing about the economic reforms in 1991. What factors led to economic reforms in 1991? The first factor which led to economic reforms, high fiscal deficit. What exactly is fiscal deficit? Fiscal deficit is the difference between the total expenditure of the government and total receipts excluding borrowings. That means the country has borrowed so much money from other countries, the country was not able to repay it back. So to repay that money, we have to mortgage our gold. The fiscal deficit of the country was too high. That's led to the fiscal deficit of the country. Normally it should be 4% of GDP, but here in 1991, it was something like 8.4% of the GDP. That was too high. So that is the first and the foremost factor that led to economic reforms in 1991 was fiscal deficit. It was too high. The country has borrowed from so many other countries and the World Bank. The country was not able to prepay back the debt and we have to mortgage our gold. And the second point was high rate of inflation. The inflation rate was too high, 16.7%. That was too high. So that's why we had to bring economic reforms. The balance of payments deficit, the balance of payment exports, it's the difference between exports and imports of goods and services to the rest of the world. There was a big deficit in the balance of payments. So that's bad. So that led to economic reforms. Gulf crisis leading to high external debt. There was a Gulf crisis, Iraq war, we call it. Because of that, the price of crude oil has gone up and that led to high external debt. We have to import oil because India is a major importer of oil. So because of that also it led to big crisis. And the last point is poor performance of public sector undertakings, PSUs we call it. The performance was very bad, public sector undertakings. So that's why the finance minister Manmohan Singh, Dr. Manmohan Singh had brought new economic policy 1990-91. So let's see once again what was the need of new economic reforms. Economic reforms 1991. The first point was high fiscal deficit. The second point was high rate of inflation. The third point is balance of payments deficit. Fourth point is Gulf crisis leading to high external debt. And the fifth point is poor performance of public sector undertakings. So we'll see once again in detail what was the need for economic reforms in 1990-91. The first point, you have high fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit refers to borrowings of the government on account of excess of its expenditure over revenue. High fiscal deficit led to inflation. Because of too much money flowing into the economy, it led to inflation. The economy cannot grow with high fiscal deficit. In 1990-91, the fiscal deficit was 8.4% of GDP. The fiscal deficit, which I told you, normally should not be more than 4% of GDP. Here it's more than double, 8.4% of GDP. So that's the first point. Fiscal deficit refers to the borrowings of the government on account of excess of its expenditure over revenue. High fiscal deficit led to inflation. The economy cannot grow with high fiscal deficit. In 1990-91, the fiscal deficit was 8.4% of GDP. The second point, high rate of inflation. In the year 1990-91, inflation reached a peak level of 16.7%, which is too high, 16.7%. the price rise. It happened because of increase in money supply. Too much of money supply has come into the economy from other countries. Prices of food grains have increased. The prices of food grains have really gone up. So that led to new economic reforms. Balance of payments deficit, BOP, was adverse on account of high imports and low exports. As a result, India had to borrow from rest of the world, which increased India's burden of foreign debt. In 1991, India's foreign exchange reserves were very low. Foreign investors losing confidence in our economy, India had to mortgage country's gold reserves with the Bank of England to repay loans taken from foreign countries. And the fourth point, Gulf crisis leading to high external debt. On account of Iraq war, there was an increase in the prices of crude oil and petroleum products. It widened our trade deficit. Poor performance of PSUs. The public sector undertakings in India were facing the problem of low productivity and poor rates of return. A huge amount was invested in their growth and development. They became a liability for the government. So we'll see once again. See, this is a very important question, right, from the board's point of view. What was the need for economic reforms in 1990-91? The first and the foremost is high fiscal deficit, which I told you fiscal deficit is the difference between the expenditure of the government and the revenue, and the fiscal deficit is very high. If the fiscal deficit is very high, the country will become dependent on other countries because of its borrowings. That's why they introduced new economic reforms. High rate of inflation. The inflation rate was something like 16.8%. That's too high. That also led to economic reforms. Balance of payments deficit. There was a deficit because our exports were very much less than our imports. The country had to import from other countries. There was a deficit in balance of payments. To meet this deficit, they have to mortgage the gold. The country, Gulf crisis, there was a Iraq war. Because of the Gulf crisis, the crude oil prices have gone up. The country had to import from other countries. That's why there was a deficit. Poor performance of public sector. Government has invested a lot of money on public sector undertakings, but they were not very productive. There was a lot of delays in it, and the production was not very encouraging. So that's why Dr. Manmohan Singh brought new economic policy in 1991.